When it says lo yiksha be'einecha, it should not be hard for you to do it. It means that the bracha is that in addition to the fact you have to give the money, you have to give it full-heartedly. You can't give it reluctantly. You can't give it. You can't feel that you're forced to do so. You have to feel that you want to give. If you give it with a full heart, therefore you get the bracha. And in such a situation, we would not apply the rule of the matan sar v'sida because it's not on the mitzvah itself. It's on how you perform the mitzvah, and therefore, the outcome, according to most opinions, is that you could actually go in and force the person to give the hanaka, to give this, even though he doesn't want to. One question that came about is that this is considered a lava nitik le'eseh, and therefore, since it's a lava nitik le'eseh, for example, there's no malchus on it. That's one of the reasons there's no malchus, because it's a lava nitik le'eseh, which means it's a negative commandment which is connected right away to a positive commandment. And in that situation, usually you do not get punished, because what the understanding is, if it tells you a negative thing and it tells you how to fix it, so since there is a remedy, you have the remedy to fix it, and therefore Beis Din has no right to enforce it. The most common case of something like that would be that if you steal something, you don't get malchus because you have the obligation to return it. It says if you steal it, you have to return it. So it's a lav of stealing, and the essay which is connected to it is you must return it. Even though you didn't return it, since you could or should return it, you'll never get malchus for it. But my question, I have a question which you don't really have an answer for, is this is really different. And the Rambam points out over here that this is a law, he specifically mentions it's a lava nitik essay. Problem is, this is sort of very different than most lava nitik essay. A lava nitik essay usually is, if you do something bad, there's a remedy of how to fix it. So if you steal something, there's a remedy of how to compensate for it. If you send the mother, if you want the bird, shluach hakan, there's a way to do so. If you do something wrong, there's a way to fix it. But over here, it's not that way at all. It's not that you've done something wrong first. You haven't done anything wrong first. If the Torah didn't tell you that you have to do the essay, which is giving the person compensation, you would never have done something wrong in the first place. So the wrong only comes after you know that there's something positive to do. It's not that this is fixing that situation. This doesn't remedy the situation of not giving. If the Torah didn't lay out the fact that you have to give in the first place, then there would be no lav. So it works the reverse way. So it's not a usual lava nitik essay. How could you apply the same rules to it? Because it's not like if not for the fact that the Torah says you have to give this person extra money when he leaves. If it did not lay that rule out, what would be wrong with letting the guy leave with that? There's no other place in Torah you see if a guy leaves and you don't pay him more than you owe him. You paid him what you owed him. You've already given him all the compensation. Where would you see there's something wrong with that? So why over here do we say, well, if it's a lava nitik say? It's really not a lava nitik say. But be as it may, all the Rishonim learn that it is, and it's also considered a lava nitin tashlumin, which means that it's a negative commandment, which brings forth a way to pay off, to monetarily pay this off, and therefore also it doesn't fall in the category of it would not fall into the category of someone who would get malchus. Another question that comes up is what happens if this money gets lost? The money that was set aside. If the money was set aside, for example, you set aside this produce. He had a whole thing set aside that he was going to give this person, and then a fire came and destroyed it. Would he have to replace it? Is it like anything that is it like a din of payah that you set it aside, and when the payah is destroyed, you don't have to go get other payah? And so therefore here also, if you set the money aside and it got destroyed, you wouldn't have the obligation to replace it. Or is it an obligation? The fact that the Eved never got it, it doesn't matter that it got destroyed. You would have to make it up anyway. So that's also a question which is unclear. Then going back a little bit about on this the idea of a mitzvah essay, the matan sar v'sida. So the Mishnah Melech goes to this at great length, and he says this may not be the same. This may not be the same situation, because over here it doesn't say right away what the schar is. The normal case, for example, of tzedakah, you don't force a person to give tzedakah, because it says because if you give tzedakah, you'll be blessed. But it says specifically one next to the other. It says that if you give tzedakah, you'll be blessed. Therefore, you don't force it. But over here, the the reward is mentioned way at the end. It's not mentioned right after the lav. The lav says you cannot let him go out with empty, and you have to give him something. Then it says later on you'll be blessed. So he says, therefore, maybe in this case we would not apply the principle. We would not apply the principle that it's a lav should, mitzvah should schar b'tzida, because it's not really next to it. It's mentioned later on, and the only time we would apply that rule that you wouldn't force him if it specifically says it in the verse next to it. And the one last thing I'm going to point out is where do we come up with what is this idea Mishnah schar b'tzida, which I point out. What is that trying to tell us? So all of a sudden it throws in here because he worked double for you. What's that have to do with anything? So this is the source. This is the source of Tosfos that we dealt with that was problematic, that if you hire someone to work for you and he doesn't finish up this, he only works part of the time, he doesn't finish and you have to pay him, they're learning it from this pasuk because it says he worked double the time of a worker. Now what does that mean? So they bring from, this really comes from the source of a pasuk in Yeshayahu that says that a person, a socher, someone who's a worker, it specifically said he works 3 years. 3 years is a normal contract, and the person does not usually work for more than 3 years. So it says he worked double. He worked double that, meaning he worked 6 years. How does he work double? From here we learned the fact that the master has the right to give him a maidservant, and the maidservant, this guy has to take care of at night. He has to take care of this maidservant, so he's working day and night. And he's working a double 6 years. It's because he's working double the shift of 2 times 3, the day work of a worker and the night work of a worker. It's 6 years, and therefore, since we see over here that the Torah compares him to a socher, compares him to this Eved to a worker, therefore that is where the source of Tosfos is bringing up that we could apply the same rule, the same way we would treat an Eved, that he's considered a worker to a certain extent. He worked a double shift. Therefore, a person who works 6 years was hired to work as a malamed. He could not finish to work. He should have the same rules as an Eved. However, most people disagree with that and say that you cannot compare an Eved at the end of the day because an Eved is not a worker. An Eved is someone who is contractually bound to this person to do whatever you want him to do, not for a specific duty, so you get to go to bed, as opposed to a worker that you hire specifically for a specific task. Therefore, if he doesn't finish a task, you should not obligate to pay him. It means that the bracha is that in addition to the fact you have to give the money, you have to give it full-heartedly. You can't